Culture and Leadership Programme Phase 1 tools look at your organisation through 5 cultural elements at all levels.
Your organisation requires leaders with the right skills and behaviours to support continuous improvement and delivery of its business strategy.
This talent management tool helps you identify the available talent and where there are gaps. Using this tool, you can look across the whole workforce now and in the future.
You can identify how many substantive leaders are in post, whether they are diverse and represent the demographics of your organisation, and whether they have the necessary leadership skills, knowledge and abilities.
Are enough people with the skills, motivation and appropriate styles in the leadership pipeline? This tool can help you determine which roles are key in your organisation. It invites you to check that policies and procedures reflect their strengths in influencing your workforce.
The change team members implementing this tool don't have to be experts in talent management or have all the answers. Skills in information gathering, influencing, facilitation and teamwork are what are needed to answer the questions posed by this tool.
Your workforce information, human resource, learning and development teams and talent management leads can all help. You can also research nationally available resources on good talent management practice.
Your change team lead for this tool should then, with others, present the findings at your synthesis session.
Leadership workforce analysis tool was really interesting for me to, in the first aspect, was actually learning to meet lots of people. So people I don't normally interact with, and basically using the tool, the questionnaire provided a huge wealth of information, not only about the actual kind of the quantitative data of the hospital in terms of how many people you have in leadership roles, their demographics, their levels of diversity, but also really the perception of the leaders I was interviewing in terms of how they felt the leadership was in the hospital. So particularly when we're looking at things like succession planning, leadership performance, and how they're induced into the hospital, the sort of the social aspect of how a leader is brought in, for me was quite fascinating. And it showed up gaps which is probably different from some of the other tools that we used with the within the programme.
So this tool was useful for assessing our organisation's culture because it specifically looked at leadership. And there are 2 parts to it. It looks at quantitative data, so looking at the composition of the leadership. But also what I found really interesting about it was it focuses on what people's perception of the leadership is. So it looks at things such as where do we have good skills and knowledge, and where are the gaps in our leadership behaviours? You know, what are we good at and what are we not so good at?
What it does, it collates very much a objective and subjective data about how they feel about the leadership within the hospital. What you're gaining from it is you're gaining some metrics in terms of on a spectrum from sort of least to worst. You're also gaining actual data in terms of how they feel about, was it a fair process for each of the aspects, whether it was succession planning, performance development, all the different kind of aspects of it. I guess the first part of it was very much focused on, and probably it was more designed at the senior level. I think something probably to add into this is, because we had the data with the other tools from at the board interview level, the senior leaders, we actually felt within the whole package of tools that we were missing some of our middle management. So we were missing some of our general manager level. So partway through, having interviewed some of the for example, head of HR, director of HR, we actually realized that we wanted to move it to a slightly sub-board level. And that became fascinating because not only are you getting people that are in leadership positions, you're getting their insight into how well they've been trained, how well developed they are. When they were brought into the organization, were they induced and socialized as a leader, or were they just brought in to do their normal job as such? So that was quite fascinating. In the end of it, with the people we interviewed, we had a huge amount of essentially filled in questionnaires from them all. And some of it went off into a little bit of a tangent and built a relationship for them to really give up their feelings about the organization. So that kind of complemented the questionnaire itself.
So the tool looks at the current, what people feel is the current knowledge and skills of the leaders in the organisation and where they believe the gaps are. It asks people to look at the leadership behaviours, and it gives you sort of 8 options, from ensuring effective performance management to modelling support and compassion. And then ask people to look at what we do least well and what we do most well. And I think what that does is it just gives you an indication of the areas that we need to focus on when we move forward, and where we might want to tailor some of our training, where we may want to think differently about how we recruit.
Overall, it's I guess the strengths of it for me were not only am I getting an opportunity to meet people in the organisation I don't normally interact with, I'm really getting quite a lot of in-depth feedback from them about how they feel about the organisation in terms of their leadership development, but also in terms of their perception of how from the very top the leadership within the organisation, but also a little bit of a feeling of what they could offer in their position to how they would develop leaders junior to them.
I think it's also really good that it looks at the demographic profile of our leaders, but also what people's perception of that is. We know that as an organisation, culture is a really big priority for us. And what this tool allows us to look at as well is, if we know that culture is a priority, where are the gaps in our leadership capability to allow us to move towards our culture strategy?
The other aspects of the data was very much sort of free text data. That was great because it enabled people to chat and to talk. I guess the harder bit of that is how you analysed it, because you were getting people's feelings on things, and that's probably more powerful, but harder for us to analyse afterwards, to sort of feel the trends that came through it.
And it also focuses a lot on succession planning. And we know that succession planning is really important because it's a big thing that motivates staff. So if staff know that there's a process in place for talent management and for succession planning, and they know that talent is being picked up and there's a process to move through to move forward with your career, it's really motivating. So I think just having that data about how staff perceive that is really important and really useful.
So the way we used the tool was, first off, we actually had some very, I guess, pure stats from the HR department. They told us of the number, there are 9,000 odd people in the organisation, how many of those they perceive to be in a leadership position. Obviously, it depends on where you draw the line on your levels. And then we had pure data on, for example, their ethnicity. We had data on the male-female divide. And we used that. So that was kind of some pure data we got from HR. What was interesting with the tool is then we discussed it, particularly if people felt that, for example, the organisation was stereotypically, for example, white and male. It was interesting because when we give them the actual data, there was a bit of reflection on the objective data as well. So I thought that was also quite interesting. So overall, within the group of culture champions, we had about 40 in the trust. There was only around 4 of us that did this specific project. And part of it was in the early stages, relative to the other tools, we were working out how many people did we really need to go around and question. So between myself, I probably sat down with around 10 people in the trust, literally sitting down for an hour, a cup of tea, going through the questionnaires. And we gained a huge amount of information. What we found when we then presented our early findings back to the culture team was that the results were pretty consistent, to the extent that we didn't feel that we needed to gain anything else from another 100 people, for example, to make it more powerful. We felt that the tool in itself, because of the range of people we discussed it with, their demographic, their different seniorities within the trust, we had a pretty rounded feel for it. We also found there was really good crossover with, for example, the board interviews. So to move forwards to the next phase, we actually didn't need more people than that. Although at one point we had considered, do we need to double, quadruple the number of people within the tool? In the end, we decided it was unnecessary.
What we found really useful about the tool is we used it to target a slightly different group of staff. So we used it to complement the focus groups and the board interviews, and we specifically targeted more of the middle managers. And we used it as well as a sort of engagement tool. because I think it helped people I think people really valued having that time to actually reflect on some of these things. And I think that was probably one of the biggest values of the tool, actually.
So in simple words, they were, of all of the questionnaires, I put all of the answers together into basically one big document. So of the 10, 15 questionnaires we had back across the 4 of us, we put all of the answers for every question together. For ones where it was, say, for example, 1 to 5 or the specific bit, we overlaid them. And then based on that, we could get, I guess, a theme of what the trend was purely from a looking at it and working out were there more 3s than 2s, for example. In terms of the, I guess, the subjective, the free text data, we basically recorded as much of it as we could do, and what we found was actually very useful, even though we had a small sample size, everyone was pretty consistent. So actually it made the analysis quite easy. There wasn't a huge divergence of opinion. And if there was a divergence, it was literally, they were very happy or very unhappy. So it made that aspect quite easy. I was very keen that when we were analysing it, that if we had 10 people and 5 said it was terrible and 5 said it was amazing, we didn't just average that out and sit in the middle, that we were clear that we said, well, half the people were unhappy and half the people were happy, for example.
So what we did when we used this tool is we, well, for all of our tools, we split them up across all of the culture champions. So this particular tool had 4 culture champions associated with it. And then we each went around and spoke to different members of staff to collect the information. It is quite a time-consuming tool, but we felt that the time that we invested with members of staff just gave us some really rich data. And what we also found useful is we cross-referenced it with some of the other tools. So for specifically the board interviews, the focus groups, the leadership survey that went out to lots of different people. And it was very consistent with what the other tools showed, but it just, in some instances, just had some more specific examples, which is just really useful when you're trying to story tell, which we know is really, really valuable for this kind of work.
As you imagine, due to COVID, the chances of all getting in the same room together was difficult, particularly as some were very much clinical and in the front lines, and within our group, some had been working from home. The reality was it became the sort of a Teams meeting where we were chatting through the findings. And I think, as happened, because I led on majority of the interviews, it was very much a case of me kind of presenting the raw data. And then there's a group of 4 of us. We kind of looked through, I guess, independently at the themes coming through. We then gathered again to discuss things a little bit further. And then after that, we presented our work to the wider culture team, working out, do we need to do anything further from this? And because the themes were so consistent across the board, it actually became easier than we initially expected it would be, given the, I guess, the amount of detail that we were getting from the tool itself. So analysing talent management within the organisation, it's massively important. Particularly what I found from using the leadership workforce analysis tool is that there's a huge skill set in leadership and we're not sharing them. So one of the things is talking to people, some people are phenomenally well trained, that have huge amounts of skills, but they're not really given the opportunity to share that. Equally, there's other leaders within the organisation are dying out to have more training. So really looking at your talent management, it was very clear early on from questioning people with the tools that even of the 10, 15 people I interviewed, half the people were very well trained, but trying to educate other people, but not given the opportunity to, whereas other people want to be trained. So there was a clear mismatch that even by process of me interviewing people, I managed to link other people up within the organisation that had particular skill sets that might have been of interest to them.
I think analysing talent management, if I can speak personally and from lots of the staff that I've spoken to during this process, a consistent frustration in many organisations is just that there isn't a robust way of progressing. And I think that leads to a lot of frustration. So being able to really get a deeper understanding of what some of those barriers are and ideas from staff about how we could do that better, and how people feel about that, I think just gives some really, really rich information that we will use going forward when we put together our culture strategy and specifically the talent management aspect of it. And also, I think if we, as an organisation, we've really committed to wanting to make improvements to our culture and improve inclusion and improve our leadership skills. And this is really important because we need to understand where those gaps are, and therefore where we need to recruit differently and where we need to invest in training and development for staff. Equality, diversity and inclusion is such an important part of being able to analyse the current culture. And I think for St George's, it's really important that we have a leadership team that is reflective of the diversity of our workforce and the population that we serve. And what this tool allows us to do is it provides the quantitative data, so what the actual story is in terms of how diverse we are and what the composition is of our leadership team at different bands. But I think what's really also important and really interesting is that it allows staff to give their perception. And what we found interesting in this tool was the different perceptions of how people feel about the diversity of the leadership teams.
So for me, the essence of the tool was it was a great opportunity to meet people you haven't met before. So for me, as a very much a clinical person, to have the opportunity to meet the corporate half of the hospital that are involved very much from the management side, it became really, it was interesting. The best way for me to do it was actually sitting down with a cup of coffee, cup of tea and chatting with them. And that seemed to work much better than, I guess some, on the flip side, I had one of the people that I interviewed that wanted to answer all the questions, and then they sent all the reply back to me and we discussed it. And that in itself, I don't think really had the same quality coming through it because it wasn't such a back and forth conversation. So although this tool is quite time consuming, every bit of it was worthwhile in terms of having that conversation, particularly with somebody that I would get some element of learning from, and I think they did as well. Certainly as part of the wider culture tool, it was breaking down barriers. It was realizing that although we work in completely different places and at no point would our paths have crossed given the size of the organization, it was great. And even now, having met some of these people, I very much use them for my ongoing work because I know there are people within the organization that have a skill set different to mine with a different reach.
One of the benefits of this tool is that it's really useful for starting the engagement process and engaging with different stakeholders. And St George's is a huge organisation with lots of staff. So using a tool like this just helps to start spreading the word that this culture work is happening, and also allows staff to have a bit of context about what the work entails and what sort of things it's looking at.
The tool itself, was to say, it's great. I managed to speak to lots of different people across the organisation. One of the things I started off doing as a bit of a tip was I actually spoke to my immediate clinical manager, because that's where I learned how to use the tool. So for when I was talking to some people that I'd never met before, it was, I guess I was a little bit more polished. So I'd certainly recommend, before you go to the most important people in your organisation that don't know you, essentially do it with people a little bit closer to you that understand as you go through tools. So that's certainly a tip I'd recommend. In terms of, I guess, the other sort of methodology, which I'm not saying we had a perfect methodology by any means, but we basically started off with a few people that were close to me. And then I asked them, who would you speak to? And as it basically went through the organization, there was head of HR, she knew a few other people, and then actually speaking with a couple of the other culture people, they were like, oh, this person would be really good to talk to. So it wasn't a unbiased methodology. It was fairly selective, but it gave me an opportunity to talk to people that were interested in leadership workforce analysis, and not necessarily people that were overly positive about their experience, but people that had an opinion, that people had some people would have training in it prior to being at the trust. So actually their outcomes were fascinating.
A hint I would give for using this tool is, at the beginning, we were unsure of what staff groups to target. And we started off looking at like the organisational chart and thinking, Should we target certain individuals through the chart? And then we decided we wanted to use this tool a bit differently and target a different layer of the organisation. And we decided to go with the sort of lower to middle management group. One thing that was really helpful was having somebody within the immediate team who had quite a good network in the organisation, and that just helped put us in touch with different people. Another thing that I think is useful, or a useful tip, would be that I think it can feel a bit daunting when you first go and meet with strangers and use this tool. So one of the things we did was just practiced it with people that we perhaps knew and felt familiar with. And then from then, as the confidence built, it started expanding that outwards.